My blood ran cold, a furious tremor starting in my hands and quickly spreading through my entire body. There it stood, a brand new, brightly painted fence, enclosing my cherished lakeside cabin. Not just any fence, mind you, but one that screamed property line with every picket. My stomach dropped as I saw it, because it was undeniably on my land. And then I saw her, smirking, standing right next to a "sold" sign plunged into my very own lawn, wearing a triumphant smile. This couldn't be happening. Karen, my HOA president, had actually done it. She gifted my cabin, my sanctuary, to her kid, and now this fence, this blatant act of trespass, was her way of marking her territory. What audacious nerve! What could possibly happen next? Life had a peculiar way of unfolding, much like a long, winding road with unexpected twists and turns. For a while, things were smooth, almost idyllic. My name is Alex, and I had purchased a charming little cabin by Crystal Lake about 5 years ago. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, a peaceful escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. The cabin sat on a generous plot of land, with tall pine trees whispering secrets in the breeze and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. I had poured my heart and soul into that place, renovating it room by room, planting a small garden, and building a sturdy dock where I could sit and watch the sunsets paint the sky in fiery hues. It was more than just a cabin, it was a dream realized, a place where I felt truly at peace. When I first moved in, the Crystal Lake Homeowners Association seemed like a distant, almost comical entity. Their rules, printed in a thick booklet, seemed mostly focused on keeping the neighborhood tidy and ensuring everyone's boat was properly registered. I'm a pretty laid-back person, and I figured as long as I kept my property neat and didn't throw wild parties, I'd be fine. The HOA president at the time was an older gentleman named Mr. Henderson, a kind and soft-spoken man who often waved as he drove by. He was more concerned with community potlucks than with finding people for a slightly overgrown lawn. But then, about 2 years ago, everything shifted. Mr. Henderson moved away to be closer to his grandchildren, and in his place stepped Brenda Wallace. Everyone called her Karen, and it wasn't hard to see why. From the moment she took over, the HOA transformed from a friendly neighborhood watch into a rigid, rule-enforcing machine. Suddenly, there were new rules popping up almost every week. No vibrant colored flower beds. All mailboxes had to be the same shade of beige. Even the type of outdoor lighting was regulated. It felt less like a community and more like a military camp. Karen lived in the largest house in the development, a sprawling mansion with perfectly manicured lawns and a security system that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. She had a reputation for being meticulous, some might even say obsessive, about appearances. Her own property was always immaculate, almost unnervingly so. She had a keen eye for anything that deviated from her idea of perfection, and she wasn't shy about issuing fines. I remember one time, my neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, received a notice because her bird feeder was non-compliant with the new aesthetic guidelines. Mrs. Gable loved her birds, and the feeder brought her so much joy. I felt terrible for her, and it was the first real sign that things were changing for the worse. I tried to be understanding at first. Maybe Karen just wanted to bring some order to the community, I thought. Perhaps her intentions were good, even if her methods were a bit overbearing. I tried to be a good neighbor, keeping my lawn trimmed, ensuring my trash cans were out of sight, and generally following the rules. I even attended a few HOA meetings, hoping to voice my concerns or at least understand her perspective. But the meetings were less about discussion and more about Karen dictating new mandates. Any questions or objections were met with a stony glare and a reminder of her authority. It was clear she wasn't interested in consensus or community input. One particularly sunny afternoon, a few months into Karen's reign, I was out on my dock, enjoying the tranquility of the lake. I had just finished painting the trim on my boathouse, a project I'd been meaning to get to for weeks. The old paint was peeling, and I wanted it to look fresh and well-maintained. I had chosen a classic deep green, a color that blended beautifully with the surrounding nature. It was a subtle change, almost unnoticeable to a casual observer. As I was packing up my painting supplies, I saw Karen's golf cart rumble down the path towards my property. My heart sank a little. I knew that look on her face, the one that meant trouble. She pulled up to the edge of my lawn, her eyes narrowed, scanning my boathouse. "Alex," she began, her voice crisp and sharp, "I see you've been doing some renovations." "Yes, just a fresh coat of paint on the boathouse," I replied, trying to keep my tone light and friendly. The old paint was looking a bit worn. She paused, her gaze fixed on the newly painted green trim. "The HOA bylaws clearly state that all exterior structures must adhere to the approved color palette," she announced, her voice rising slightly. "Green is not an approved color for boathouse trim." I blinked, genuinely surprised. "Really? I don't recall seeing anything about specific trim colors in the guidelines. I thought it was just about maintaining a neat appearance." "It's in there, Alex. Section 3, subsection B, paragraph 4. All exterior paints, including trim, must be selected from the approved neutral color scheme provided by the HOA board. Green is not neutral." She pulled out a small, laminated card from her pocket, almost as if she expected this conversation, and pointed to a list of beige, off-white, and pale gray swatches. I was flabbergasted. "But it's a dark green, it blends right in with the trees. It's hardly an eyesore." "That's not the point," she stated, her jaw set. "The point is compliance. You have 2 weeks to repaint the trim in an approved color, or you will be assessed a daily fine of $50. $50 a day. For a bit of green paint." It seemed utterly preposterous. I felt a surge of frustration, but I knew arguing with Karen was like talking to a brick wall. She thrived on control, on finding even the smallest infraction to assert her authority. I sighed, knowing I would have to spend another weekend repainting the entire trim, this time in a bland, uninspired beige. It was a small act of defiance on her part, a way to show who was boss, and it stung. It wasn't about the color, it was about the power. The incident with the boathouse trim was just one of many similar encounters. It seemed Karen had a particular interest in my property. Perhaps it was because my cabin was one of the largest plots, or maybe it was simply because I wasn't as quick to fall in line as some of the other residents. She would frequently drive by, often stopping to observe what I was doing. If I left my gardening tools out for too long, a polite but firm notice would appear in my mailbox. If a single weed dared to sprout in my flower bed, would receive a friendly reminder about landscape maintenance. It felt like I was constantly under surveillance, and the joy I once felt in maintaining my property slowly began to erode, replaced by a constant low-level anxiety. Despite these annoyances, I tried to focus on the positive aspects of cabin life. I still loved the lake, the fresh air, and the quiet evenings. My friends, Sarah and David, would often visit on weekends, and we'd spend hours fishing, kayaking, or just sitting by a bonfire, sharing stories and laughter. They often joked about Karen, calling her the Queen of Beige and offering their sympathies. But even their humor couldn't fully shake the feeling of being under a microscope. One particularly warm summer evening, I was hosting a small barbecue for Sarah and David. We had just finished eating and were sitting on the porch, enjoying the gentle breeze and the chirping of crickets. Suddenly, a bright spotlight beamed onto my property from the street. We all squinted, trying to see where it was coming from. It was Karen's house. She had installed new, incredibly powerful floodlights, and they were pointed directly at my cabin. Not just illuminating her own property, but glaring directly into my living room and porch. "What in the world?" David exclaimed, shielding his eyes. "That's new," Sarah added, her brow furrowed. "Are those," pointed at us. I knew exactly what it was. It was another tactic. A way to subtly, or not so subtly, assert her presence and remind me that she was watching. It was invasive, obnoxious, and utterly unnecessary. I tried to ignore it, but the harsh glare made it impossible to relax. It felt like an interrogation. I got up, walked inside, and drew the blinds, but the light still seeped in around the edges, a constant reminder of her watchful eye. The next morning, I checked the HOA bylaws. Sure enough, there was a vague clause about adequate exterior lighting for safety and security. But nothing about blinding your neighbors with spotlights. I drafted a polite but firm email to the HOA board, asking about the new lighting and pointing out that it was shining directly into my private residence, causing a disturbance. Karen's response came swiftly, and it was dripping with passive aggressiveness. She claimed the lights were a necessary security measure for the entire community and that any temporary inconvenience was outweighed by the benefit of increased safety. She even implied that if I found the lights too bright, perhaps I was simply unaccustomed to proper security measures. It was a thinly veiled jab, suggesting I was somehow less responsible for my property. I knew it was a losing battle. She had found a loophole, and she was exploiting it to make my life uncomfortable. The bright lights became a nightly torment. They robbed me of the peaceful evenings I cherished, forcing me to keep my blinds drawn, transforming my cozy cabin into a perpetual twilight zone after dark. It was a constant, irritating presence, a subtle form of psychological warfare. I tried to reason with her again, even offering to help pay for different, less intrusive lighting solutions that would benefit the whole community, but she simply dismissed my suggestions with a wave of her hand. Her mind was made up. One morning, about 6 months after the lights went up, I woke up to a strange noise. A low, rumbling hum. I looked out my window and saw a team of surveyors on my property, their equipment glinting in the morning sun. They were walking around, taking measurements, hammering in small flags into the ground. My heart began to pound. What were they doing? I walked outside, a knot forming in my stomach. "Excuse me," I called out to one of the surveyors, a tall man with a clipboard. "Can I help you? What are you doing on my property?" He looked up, surprised. "Oh, sorry, didn't see you there. We're just confirming the property lines for the Crystal Lake HOA. New development project." "New development project?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. "What development project?" He shrugged. "Just following orders. Some new cabins going in, I hear. This whole area is getting a bit of an overhaul." He gestured vaguely towards my land, then further down the lake. My blood ran cold. New cabins? On my land? I had never heard a word about any development. The HOA had never mentioned it in any meeting, nor had they sent out any notices. This was beyond a simple rule infraction, this felt like a direct threat to my property. I watched them, a terrible sense of unease washing over me. They worked methodically, placing stakes at various points along what I knew to be my property line, but they seemed to be extending inward. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. This was a new low, even for Karen. What new nightmare was she concocting now? My eyes darted around, trying to find a clue, an explanation for this egregious intrusion. I then noticed a woman speaking to Karen at the edge of my property, holding some papers and pointing towards my cabin. The woman smiled at Karen, giving her a handshake. My stomach dropped even further, and a chilling thought began to form in my mind. This wasn't just a general development. This was something targeted, something far more sinister. And it involved my cabin. A cold dread seeped into my bones as I watched the surveyors continue their work, their flags marking out lines that felt entirely wrong. The interaction between Karen and the other woman, a solicitor from what I could gather, was deeply unsettling. The handshake, the smiles, the way they gestured towards my cabin, it all painted a picture of a conspiracy, a calculated move against me. My mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what was unfolding. This wasn't just about a boathouse color or bright lights, this was about my land, my home. I approached Karen, my voice tight with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Karen, what is going on here? Why are there surveyors on my property? What new development are you talking about? She turned, her smile fading slightly, replaced by that familiar look of condescending authority. Alex, there's no need for alarm. These are official surveyors, simply performing a routine check of the property lines. The HOA is simply ensuring all plots are correctly demarcated for future planning. Future planning? What future planning involves my property without my knowledge? I pressed, my voice rising. I received no notice, no information about any development near my cabin. All residents were informed of potential future development plans in the last HOA newsletter, she replied, her tone dismissive. Perhaps you overlooked it. Regardless, this is a standard procedure. We are merely confirming boundaries. Confirming boundaries that appear to be shifting inward, onto my land? I shot back, gesturing wildly at the freshly placed flags. Those flags are well within my known property lines, lines that have been established for years. She sighed, as if I were a particularly difficult child. Alex, property lines can sometimes be subject to minor adjustments based on more precise surveys. It's all perfectly legal and above board. The HOA always acts in the best interest of the community. The best interest of the community, or in her best interest. The words felt hollow, a flimsy excuse for what felt like an outright land grab. My head spun. How could this be happening? Was it even possible for the HOA to just redefine property lines? I knew my deed clearly outlined my plot. This felt illegal, a blatant overreach of power. I stood there, watching the surveyors, feeling utterly helpless. The sun beat down, but I shivered, a chill running through me. I needed to act, and fast. The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls and anxious research. I dug out my property deed, meticulously examining the legal description and the accompanying survey map from when I purchased the cabin. There was no ambiguity, my property lines were clearly defined. I contacted a real estate lawyer, Mr. Davidson, an older, seasoned professional known for his meticulous attention to detail. He listened patiently as I recounted the entire saga, from the boathouse paint to the blinding lights and now, the mysterious surveyors. Mr. Davidson's initial reaction was cautious. HOAs have significant power, Alex, but they cannot arbitrarily redraw property lines. That's a matter of deed and legal surveys. There must be something more at play here. He advised me to hire my own independent surveyor immediately. Get them out there to mark your boundaries based on your deed. That will give us a clear baseline. And collect any and all documentation you have from the HOA, newsletters, emails, meeting minutes, anything at all related to this new development. Armed with Mr. Davidson's advice, I felt a flicker of hope. I booked a highly reputable surveyor, Mr. Kelly, who promised to come out within a few days. In the meantime, I started digging through every piece of paper from the HOA. Karen had mentioned a newsletter, but I distinctly remembered reading every single one. There was no mention of any specific development affecting my property, only vague references to community enhancements and future growth initiatives. It was all so carefully worded, so deliberately obscure. When Mr. Kelly, my surveyor, arrived, I showed him my deed and the flags the other surveyors had left. He raised an eyebrow, a slight frown on his face. These flags are definitely off, Alex. Significantly off, in some places. If this is where they're claiming the new line is, they're encroaching on your land by a good 20 feet in some areas, even more near the lakefront. My heart sank even further, confirming my worst fears. He spent the entire day meticulously surveying my property, cross-referencing his measurements with my deed. By the end of the day, he had placed his own bright orange flags, clearly marking my true property lines. They stood defiantly against the other, incorrect, flags, a stark visual representation of the dispute. "There you go, Alex," Mr. Kelly said, wiping sweat from his brow. "These are your official lines, based on your deed. If anyone tries to argue otherwise, you have legal standing." I thanked him, feeling a renewed sense of resolve. I had proof now. Solid, indisputable proof. I sent all the documentation, including Mr. Kelly's detailed survey report, to Mr. Davidson. He immediately drafted a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA board, demanding they remove the other surveyors' flags and halt any further activity on my property. The letter also stated my intention to pursue legal action if they failed to comply. For a few days, there was an eerie silence from the HOA. No threatening emails, no drive-bys from Karen. It was almost unsettling, like the calm before a storm. I spent those days feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation. What would Karen do next? Would she back down, or would she escalate? Given her track record, I suspected the latter. Then, the letter arrived. Not from the HOA directly, but from their legal counsel, a large, well-known law firm based in the city. The letter was formal, cold, and utterly unyielding. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that the HOA had commissioned its own independent survey, which, according to them, showed that the new boundaries were correct and that my property had, in fact, been overstated in my original deed. They claimed that the land in question was common property belonging to the HOA and that I had been unknowingly encroaching upon it for years. They demanded I remove my surveyor's flags and threatened legal action for obstruction of community development if I didn't comply within 48 hours. I immediately called Mr. Davidson, my voice trembling with indignation as I read him the letter. "They're lying. My deed is clear, Mr. Kelly's survey is accurate. How can they just claim my land?" Mr. Davidson was calm, his voice reassuring. "This is a classic tactic, Alex. They're trying to intimidate you, to make you doubt your own documentation. They have their surveyor, you have yours. Now it becomes a battle of surveys, and potentially, a legal battle for ownership. This is why we hired Mr. Kelly. We're prepared for this." He explained that we would need to formally challenge their claim, potentially leading to a court case where both surveys would be presented and evaluated by a judge. It would be costly, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. The thought of a long, drawn-out legal fight filled me with dread, but I also felt a fierce determination. I wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone, bully me out of my property. This was my home, my sanctuary, and I would fight for it. The very next day, a new surprise awaited me. I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery. I rushed to my window and looked out, my jaw dropping in horror. A team of workers, seemingly unfazed by my flags, were now actively digging on what I knew to be my land. Not just minor digging, but significant earth-moving equipment, tearing up the ground, uprooting a small cluster of my beloved pine trees that stood near the original property line. They were clearing a path, creating a foundation, for something large and permanent. It was a blatant act of aggression, a direct challenge to my ownership, ignoring all legal correspondence. My blood ran cold, a furious tremor starting in my hands and quickly spreading through my entire body. I knew then that Karen had no intention of backing down. She was escalating, pushing the boundaries, literally, to see how far she could go. And then I saw it, the new fence, brightly painted and enclosing what was undeniably my cherished lakeside cabin. It wasn't just a random act, this was a deliberate move, a malicious act of conquest. My stomach dropped as I saw it, because it was undeniably on my land. And then I saw her, smirking, standing right next to a "sold" sign plunged into my very own lawn, wearing a triumphant smile. This couldn't be happening. Karen, my HOA president, had actually done it. She gifted my cabin, my sanctuary, to her kid, and now this fence, this blatant act of trespass, was her way of marking her territory. What audacious nerve! What could possibly happen next? The sight of the fence, stark and unforgiving, cutting through what was undeniably my property, was a punch to the gut. The "sold" sign, brazenly planted in my lawn, felt like a cruel joke. And Karen, standing there, a smug look on her face, confirmed my worst fears. This wasn't just about land, it was personal. She wasn't just claiming my property, she was giving it away. To her kid. The audacity was truly breathtaking. My blood ran cold, a furious tremor starting in my hands and quickly spreading through my entire body. I knew in that moment that this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a war. I had to confront her, to demand an explanation for this outrageous act of aggression. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to rush out there, tear down that fence, and rip out that sign. But a calmer, more strategic part of my brain held me back. I needed to think, to plan, to not give her the satisfaction of seeing me completely unhinged. I watched, hidden from view, as she continued to admire her handiwork, occasionally glancing towards my cabin as if expecting me to emerge, defeated. The surveyors were packing up, their job seemingly done. The heavy machinery that had torn up my trees now sat idle, a silent testament to the destruction. I took a deep, shaky breath, fighting for control. I had to remain calm, even though every instinct told me to explode. I immediately called Mr. Davidson, my voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "Mr. Davidson, you won't believe this. They've built a fence. On my property. And Karen's out there with a 'sold' sign, acting like she's given my cabin away to her kid." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "They've done what?" Mr. Davidson's voice, usually so composed, held a note of genuine shock. "That's an overt act of trespass and a clear attempt at adverse possession, Alex. This significantly changes things. This moves beyond a property line dispute into a direct challenge to your ownership." He told me to take as many pictures and videos as possible, documenting everything. "Do not engage with her directly right now, Alex. Do not touch that fence or that sign. We need to document everything for court. This is a clear escalation, and we will respond accordingly." I spent the next hour meticulously documenting the scene. Every angle of the new fence, the "sold" sign, the disturbed earth where my trees once stood. My hands shook as I held my phone, but I forced myself to be steady, to capture every detail. I felt a profound sense of violation, as if my personal space had been invaded and desecrated. My peaceful sanctuary, the place I loved, was now a battleground. Later that day, after Karen and the others had left, I walked out to the new fence. It was sturdy, professionally built, and extended far into my property, effectively cutting off a significant portion of my lakeside access and encircling a large part of my yard. The "sold" sign was prominently displayed, facing the street, a humiliating public declaration. It bore the name of a local real estate agent, and below it, in smaller print, proudly presented by the Crystal Lake HOA. This was a bold, arrogant move, designed to assert control and humiliate me. I sent all the new evidence to Mr. Davidson. He immediately filed an emergency injunction with the court, seeking an order to halt all construction on my property, demand the removal of the fence and sign, and prevent the HOA from any further attempts to sell or transfer my land. He also stated we would be seeking significant damages for trespass, property damage, and emotional distress. The legal battle was now in full swing, and it was intense. Karen, through the HOA's powerful law firm, responded by doubling down on their claims. They presented their revised survey as absolute proof, arguing that I was the one encroaching on common HOA land. They dismissed my evidence as fabricated or misinterpreted. Their lawyers were aggressive, trying to paint me as an uncooperative and litigious resident who was trying to obstruct legitimate community development. They even tried to suggest that my original deed was faulty, a claim that made my blood boil. The injunction hearing was scheduled quickly due to the urgency of the situation. It was a tense day in court. Mr. Davidson presented my case meticulously, laying out all the evidence, my original deed, Mr. Kelly's survey, and the extensive photos and videos of the fence and the sold sign. He argued eloquently that the HOA's actions were a blatant violation of my property rights and an egregious act of trespass. The HOA's lawyers, in turn, presented their own surveyor, who spun a convoluted tale about historical land grants and obscure easements that supposedly justified their new boundaries. They paraded Karen as a witness, who, under oath, presented herself as a benevolent community leader simply trying to rectify a long-standing property discrepancy for the good of all residents. She spoke of her vision for the community, how my cabin was holding back progress, and how her child, a supposed budding architect, was planning to build a model sustainable home on the newly acquired land. Hearing her talk about gifting my cabin to her child was infuriating. The judge, a stern but fair-minded woman named Judge Thompson, listened intently to both sides. She asked probing questions, cutting through the legal jargon and getting to the heart of the matter. At one point, she asked Karen directly, "Ms. Wallace, are you claiming that the original deed for Mr. Johnson's property is invalid, or that the land described in it simply doesn't belong to him?" Karen hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under the direct scrutiny. "Your Honor, we believe there was a clerical error in the original land division, and our survey is simply correcting that error. The land in question is common property that was mistakenly included in Mr. Johnson's deed." Judge Thompson arched an eyebrow. "And you believe you have the authority, as an HOA, to unilaterally correct a deed and seize private property without due process or compensation?" Karen stammered, "We are merely reclaiming what is rightfully the community's, Your Honor, for the benefit of all members." It was a crucial moment. Her answer, though carefully worded, exposed the sheer arrogance and overreach of the HOA's position. The judge seemed unconvinced by their arguments. After listening to all the testimony, Judge Thompson reserved her decision, stating she needed time to review all the documents and surveys. She warned both parties against any further aggressive actions while she deliberated. The injunction was not immediately granted, which was a disappointment, but it wasn't denied either. It felt like a temporary reprieve, but the looming uncertainty was agonizing. The period of waiting for the judge's decision was excruciating. Every day felt like an eternity. I was constantly on edge, checking my windows, half expecting to see more construction or another one of Karen's schemes. The sold sign remained, a mocking symbol of her perceived victory, and the fence stood as a physical barrier, dividing my once whole property. My peaceful cabin life was shattered, replaced by a constant state of anxiety and vigilance. My friends, Sarah and David, were incredibly supportive. They visited often, bringing food, offering to help with anything I needed. They helped me take more photos, serving as witnesses to the ongoing trespass. "She's just trying to wear you down, Alex," Sarah would say, "don't let her win." Their presence was a comfort, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. During this time, I started noticing subtle shifts in the neighborhood. Some residents, who had always been quiet and subservient to Karen, started approaching me, cautiously at first, then more openly. They would express their quiet support, whispering their own stories of Karen's tyranny. Mrs. Gable, whose bird feeder had been deemed non-compliant, brought me a freshly baked pie, her eyes filled with sympathy. "Don't you give up, dear," she whispered, "she's gone too far this time." A few other neighbors, emboldened by my defiance, started asking questions at HOA meetings, challenging Karen's authority in small ways. The tide, ever so slightly, seemed to be turning. Karen's iron grip on the community was beginning to loosen, even if just by a fraction. Her extreme actions against me, particularly the brazen attempt to claim my land, seemed to have awakened a quiet rebellion among some of the residents. It was a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark time. Then, one evening, as I was sitting on my porch, trying to find some semblance of peace despite the encroaching fence and the blinding floodlights, I heard a strange noise from the direction of Karen's house. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, followed by what sounded like faint drilling. My curiosity, mixed with a healthy dose of suspicion, got the better of me. I walked around to the side of my cabin, peering through the trees towards her property. What I saw sent a fresh wave of shock through me. There, under the cover of darkness, was a small crew of workers, illuminated by portable lights, actively installing something substantial. It looked like a large, imposing structure. It was on her property, but it seemed positioned to dominate the entire lakefront, potentially blocking views for other residents. And it was clear it was being constructed quickly, almost stealthily, under the cover of night. This was another one of Karen's clandestine projects, undoubtedly designed to further assert her power and control over the lake, and perhaps to make my life even more miserable. What could it be? And what was she planning now? The rhythmic thumping and drilling from Karen's property continued into the night, a persistent hum that kept me awake. My mind raced, trying to decipher what she was building under such secrecy. The sheer audacity of her actions, especially after the judge's warning, was astounding. It seemed she genuinely believed herself to be above the law, capable of doing whatever she pleased. The next morning, the mystery of Karen's clandestine construction was revealed, and it was far worse than I had imagined. As the sun rose, casting long shadows over the lake, I saw it, a massive, multi-tiered boat dock, jutting out far into Crystal Lake. It wasn't just a dock, it was a behemoth, a colossal structure that dwarfed every other dock on the lake. It had multiple slips for boats, a covered seating area, and even what looked like a small, enclosed room. It was an extravagant, ostentatious display of wealth and power, and it completely dominated the view from my cabin. My heart sank. Not only did it block a significant portion of my once unobstructed lake view, but it was also clearly violating multiple HOA bylaws regarding dock size and placement. Crystal Lake had strict regulations to maintain its natural beauty and ensure fair access for all residents. Karen's monstrosity disregarded every single one of them. This wasn't just about obstructing my view, it was about her staking a claim to the lake itself, making a grand statement that she controlled everything. I immediately grabbed my phone and started taking pictures, documenting the sheer scale of the new dock and how it impacted my view. It was a clear violation, designed to inflict maximum annoyance and to further cement her perceived dominance. The fact that it had been built so quickly, under the cover of night, spoke volumes about her intent to avoid scrutiny. I sent the photos to Mr. Davidson. He was equally appalled. "This is beyond reckless, Alex. She's ignoring the injunction entirely, and violating community bylaws. This will certainly bolster our case in court, but it also shows she's completely unconcerned with legal consequences. Mr. Davidson advised me to file a complaint with the state's Environmental Protection Agency and the local zoning board. This dock is likely in violation of several state and local regulations regarding waterfront construction, not just HOA bylaws. We need to hit her from every angle." So, I spent the next few days tirelessly researching and filing complaints. I gathered all the relevant documentation on dock regulations, measured the dock's dimensions as best I could from my property, and submitted detailed reports to both the state and local authorities. It felt good to take proactive steps, to fight back with legal and administrative action, rather than simply reacting to her provocations. Meanwhile, life at the cabin became a constant battle against Karen's escalating tactics. The bright floodlights continued to shine, forcing me to keep my blinds perpetually drawn after sunset. The "sold" sign remained, a constant visual insult. And now, the giant dock stood as a symbol of her unchecked ambition. The peace and tranquility I once cherished were replaced by a simmering resentment and a perpetual sense of being under siege. Yet, amidst all this, something subtle began to shift within the community. The residents who had initially been cautious in their support became more vocal. The sheer brazenness of Karen's actions, the fence, the sold sign, and especially the monstrous dock, was too much for many to ignore. They started speaking up at HOA meetings, not just whispering their concerns but openly questioning Karen's decisions. One evening, at a particularly heated HOA meeting, a longtime resident named Susan Rodriguez stood up, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "Miss Wallace," she began, looking directly at Karen, "many of us are concerned about the new dock constructed on your property. It's significantly larger than anything allowed by our bylaws, and it obstructs the view for many of us. What happened to following the rules that we all have to abide by?" Karen, usually unflappable, looked visibly annoyed. "Mrs. Rodriguez, that dock is a private structure on private property. It is fully compliant with all necessary regulations." She emphasized necessary, a clear attempt to skirt around the HOA's own rules. But Susan wasn't deterred. "And what about the fence on Mr. Johnson's property, and the sold sign? Is that necessary, too? It seems some rules only apply to some people, Ms. Wallace, and not to others. We joined this community for peace and order, not for blatant land grabs and property disputes." Other residents chimed in, expressing similar frustrations. The meeting, which Karen usually controlled with an iron fist, devolved into a chorus of complaints and questions she struggled to answer. Her usual calm demeanor began to crack, revealing flashes of anger. It was clear that her power was no longer absolute, that her reign of terror was facing significant pushback. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. The legal process, however, was slow and meticulous. The judge's decision on the injunction was still pending, and the complaints to the environmental and zoning authorities would take time to investigate. Mr. Davidson assured me that we had a strong case, but that legal battles could be protracted. Then, one morning, as I was preparing my coffee, I noticed something strange about the sold sign. It looked different. Smaller, perhaps? Or maybe it was just my imagination, playing tricks on me in my stressed state. I walked closer, my eyes narrowing. It wasn't smaller, but something had definitely changed. The real estate agent's name was still there, but below it, the words, "proudly presented by the Crystal Lake HOA," were gone. In their place, scrawled in sloppy, almost childish handwriting, were the words, "Future Home of Tiffany Wallace." My heart pounded. Tiffany Wallace. Karen's daughter. This was not just an idle threat or a power play anymore, this was a personal declaration. Karen wasn't just claiming the land for the HOA, she was directly gifting my cabin, my sanctuary, to her own child. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about community good, or correcting errors, or property lines. It was about pure, unadulterated entitlement. This was her twisted gift to her daughter, a brazen act of maternal generosity at my expense. It was a deeply unsettling revelation, and it ignited a new, furious resolve within me. I was not just fighting for my land, I was fighting against a deeply personal invasion. And I knew then, with absolute certainty, that I would never, ever back down. In fact, I needed to make my own statement, a public and undeniable declaration of ownership that would leave no room for doubt. And I knew exactly how I would do it. What could that be? The scrawled words, "Future Home of Tiffany Wallace," burned into my mind like a brand. This wasn't just a power play. It was a brazen, personal theft. My cabin, my home, was being treated as a personal gift from Karen to her daughter. The sheer arrogance of it fueled a new, cold determination within me. I was done reacting. It was time to make my own indelible mark, a statement that Karen and Tiffany Wallace would never forget. The idea came to me swiftly, a bold and undeniable act of reclaiming my territory. It wasn't about violence or aggression, but about an unassailable declaration of ownership. I thought about the fence, the one she had so proudly erected, and a mischievous, almost defiant grin spread across my face. I would build my own fence, one that truly marked my territory, one that would deliver a message she couldn't possibly ignore or tear down without exposing herself to immense legal peril. This fence wouldn't just be on my property, it would incorporate her own illegal encroachment, effectively turning her aggressive act against her. I immediately called Mr. Davidson, barely containing my excitement as I laid out my plan. He listened, silent for a moment, and then a chuckle escaped him. "Alex," he said, "that is audacious. And brilliant. If done correctly, it could be a masterstroke. It's a clear, undeniable assertion of your property rights, using her own actions against her, and it puts the ball squarely in her court to explain why she shouldn't be held liable for what you're about to do." He quickly outlined the legal nuances. My surveyor, Mr. Kelly, had meticulously marked my true property lines. Karen's fence, her sold sign, and the initial land disturbance were all clearly on my side of those lines. My plan was to build a new, much stronger fence, precisely along my surveyor's confirmed property line. The key was that this new fence would enclose not only my cabin but also a significant portion of her newly built, illegally placed fence and the sold sign. It would effectively trap her fence and her sign within my newly demarcated property. This would create an undeniable visual argument in court. How could she claim my land was hers, or that she had a right to build on it, if her own structures were now undeniably enclosed by my legitimate property boundary? It would force her to either admit her trespass or remove her own structures from my enclosed land, an act that would publicly concede her error. The cost of such a reversal, not just financially but in terms of public humiliation within the HOA, would be enormous. With Mr. Davidson's legal blessing, I began to plan. I hired a new, discreet, and highly skilled fencing crew, emphasizing that this was a rush job and needed to be done with absolute precision according to Mr. Kelly's survey markers. I didn't want any fanfare, I wanted it to be a swift, surgical operation. I specifically requested a tall, robust privacy fence, made of dark, heavy-duty material that would stand in stark contrast to her flimsy, brightly painted structure. This wasn't just about marking a line, it was about sending a message. The fence crew arrived early one morning, before sunrise, a tactical decision to minimize any immediate confrontation with Karen. The air was still, and a light mist hung over the lake. I met them with Mr. Kelly's survey map, pointing out every last marker. They worked with quiet efficiency, digging deep post holes, setting the foundations with concrete, and erecting the tall panels. The steady thud of hammers echoed softly across the calm water. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the lake, the outline of my new fence began to take shape. It rose quickly, a dark, imposing barrier that slowly but surely encompassed Karen's brightly painted fence. Panel by panel, her trespass became my enclosure. The sold sign, with its audacious claim, was swallowed whole, now standing inside my newly fortified boundary. It was a poetic act of defiance. My heart swelled with a mixture of vindication and triumph as I watched them work. This wasn't just a fence, it was a symbol of my unwavering resolve. It was my way of saying, "This is mine. You cannot take it. And your attempts to do so will only ensnare you." By mid-morning, the fence was complete. It stood tall and unyielding, a powerful statement of ownership. It effectively created a new, undeniable perimeter around my cabin, clearly defining my land based on my true deed. Karen's fence, so proudly erected, now stood like a trapped animal, completely enclosed within my new boundary. The sold sign, intended to announce a new owner, now simply marked a parcel of land that was undeniably mine, enclosed by my fence. It was a sight to behold. I took new photos and videos, carefully documenting the entire scene, my strong, dark fence, her flimsy, brightly colored fence now a prisoner within it, and the sold sign looking utterly ridiculous in its new, enclosed state. I sent everything to Mr. Davidson. "It's done," I messaged him, a triumphant note in my voice. The reaction was swift. It wasn't long before Karen's golf cart, usually so confident, came screeching to a halt at the edge of my newly fenced property. She stared, her mouth agape, her face slowly turning a mottled shade of red. Her eyes darted from my fence to her enclosed fence, then to the "sold" sign, now mocking her from within my boundaries. She looked absolutely bewildered, then enraged. She began to pace, muttering to herself, occasionally pointing an accusatory finger at my fence. Her usual composed demeanor had completely shattered. She pulled out her phone, frantically dialing, her voice rising in agitated tones. I could almost hear her sputtering about the outrageous and illegal act of fencing her fence. The irony was palpable. She, the self-proclaimed enforcer of rules, was now trapped by her own violations, caught in a legal snare of her own making. I watched from my porch, a quiet satisfaction spreading through me. This wasn't just a win, it was a psychological victory. She had underestimated me, had pushed too far, and now she was facing the consequences of her unchecked arrogance. The ball was now entirely in her court. Would she try to tear down my fence, an act that would be a clear violation of a private property boundary and further escalate the legal battle against her? Or would she be forced to admit her prior trespass and remove her own enclosed structures, a public admission of defeat? As I sat there, enjoying the quiet hum of the lake, no longer marred by her blinding floodlights, which now seemed comically futile against my new privacy fence, I heard a new sound. It wasn't the rumbling of her golf cart, or the frantic ringing of her phone. It was the distinct sound of a very loud, very agitated barking, followed by a frustrated shout from Karen. It was coming from the direction of her absurdly large, illegal dock. Something was clearly wrong down there, something that was causing her a great deal of distress. And I had a feeling, a rather delightful feeling, that the universe was finally beginning to deliver some poetic justice. What could possibly be happening now that was causing such a ruckus for Karen? The agitated barking and Karen's frustrated shouts grew louder, echoing across the still lake. I walked around the new, formidable fence, curious about the commotion. The privacy fence I had just installed perfectly blocked out her ridiculous floodlights, creating a much-needed sense of peace in my yard. But the sounds from her dock suggested anything but peace for her. I approached the edge of my property near the lake, where my new fence ended, and peered towards her monstrous, illegally built dock. What I saw made me stop dead in my tracks, a genuine laugh bubbling up inside me. It was absolute chaos. Karen, drenched from head to toe, was flailing wildly in the shallow water next to her enormous dock. A large, shaggy golden retriever, clearly not hers, was splashing enthusiastically around her, barking joyfully and trying to rescue her by gently nudging her with its nose. Next to the dock, a brand new, very expensive-looking jet ski, still tied with a bright red bow, was slowly sinking into the lake, a stream of bubbles rising from its submerged engine. "Get off me, you beast!" Karen shrieked, swatting at the dog, which only seemed to interpret her struggles as a game. "My jet ski! It's sinking! Someone help me!" From the shore, a young woman, probably in her early 20s, stood wringing her hands, her face a mixture of panic and distress. This must be Tiffany, Karen's daughter, the supposed budding architect, who was to inherit my cabin. "Mom, the dog. And the jet ski," she wailed. A small crowd of neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the commotion. They watched, some with wide eyes, others barely suppressing smiles. Mrs. Gable was among them, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a giggle. It turned out that Karen had planned a surprise dock inauguration for Tiffany, complete with the brand new jet ski, a lavish gift for her daughter. However, a local family's beloved golden retriever, named Captain, known for his friendly but overly enthusiastic nature and his love for the lake, had somehow gotten loose. Captain, seeing the bright red bow on the jet ski and hearing the excited squeals from Tiffany, assumed it was a new toy and had bounded onto the dock, startling Karen as she was preparing to unveil the gift. In her surprise, Karen had stumbled, slipping on the wet dock and tumbling into the lake. As she fell, she had accidentally bumped the jet ski's mooring, sending it sliding off the dock and into the water. The jet ski, not properly secured and perhaps not quite ready for launch, had begun to take on water, its engine sputtering before going silent. Captain, in his boundless canine kindness, immediately jumped in after her, convinced she was drowning and needed saving. The scene was pure, unadulterated slapstick. Karen, furious and humiliated, was being rescued by a dog she clearly despised, while her expensive gift sank slowly into the lake. Tiffany looked utterly mortified. Just then, two official-looking vehicles pulled up. One had the logo of the state's Environmental Protection Agency, the other, the local zoning board. The very complaints Mr. Davidson had helped me file were now bearing fruit. Officials stepped out, clipboards in hand, their eyes immediately drawn to the massive, illegal dock, and then to the sinking jet ski. "Ms. Wallace," one of the environmental agents called out, his voice stern. "We're here regarding multiple complaints about this structure. It appears to be in violation of several state and local regulations." Karen, still dripping wet and fuming, spluttered, "This is a private dock. And I'm in the middle of a personal emergency." "Private or not, it appears to exceed all permitted dimensions for Crystal Lake," the zoning official added, taking notes. "And we have reports of construction outside of permitted hours and without proper permits." The situation for Karen went from bad to worse. The environmental agents began to inspect the colossal dock, pointing out its various infringements. The zoning officials started taking measurements, confirming what everyone already knew: it was far too big, too intrusive, and too obviously in violation of every rule she pretended to uphold. As the commotion continued, a sleek black car pulled up. Out stepped Mr. Davidson, accompanied by a small, dignified woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. It was Judge Thompson. She walked over, observing the scene, her gaze lingering on the sinking jet ski, then on Karen's flailing attempts to escape Captain's helpful nudges. "Ms. Wallace," Judge Thompson stated, her voice cutting through the noise, "I believe I warned you against any further aggressive actions while this court deliberated. Building this oversized dock, which clearly violates community standards, and further attempting to dispose of Mr. Johnson's property, seems to fall squarely under aggressive actions." Karen's jaw dropped. She tried to speak, but only choked on lake water. Judge Thompson continued, her voice gaining authority. "The court has reviewed all submissions regarding the property dispute between Mr. Johnson and the Crystal Lake HOA. After careful consideration of the deeds and independent surveys, particularly the egregious act of erecting a sold sign and a fence on Mr. Johnson's documented property, and the subsequent act of Mr. Johnson correctly fencing his own property in response, this court finds overwhelmingly in favor of Mr. Johnson." A ripple went through the crowd of neighbors. Some gasped, others exchanged delighted glances. "The HOA's claims of a clerical error are baseless," Judge Thompson declared. "Their surveyor's findings are deemed inaccurate and unreliable. The court orders the immediate removal of the HOA's fence and the sold sign from Mr. Johnson's property. Furthermore, the HOA is ordered to compensate Mr. Johnson for all legal fees, surveyor costs, and damages incurred due to trespass and emotional distress, totaling a significant sum. Additionally, the HOA must cover the cost of restoring Mr. Johnson's property, including the replacement of any damaged trees." Karen, now completely out of the water, stood dripping, her face a mask of utter defeat and fury. Her reign was officially over. The power she had so desperately craved had crumbled before her eyes. As for this dock, Judge Thompson gestured towards the sinking jet ski and the massive structure, given the clear violations of local and state regulations, as well as HOA bylaws, I strongly recommend the HOA board immediately vote to have it dismantled at Ms. Wallace's personal expense. Failure to do so will result in further legal action and potentially severe fines against the HOA and its acting president." She gave Karen a pointed look. The HOA board, present at the scene and now seeing the full extent of Karen's downfall, quickly convened a huddle. They knew their legal standing was shattered. Within minutes, a vote was taken, and the decision was unanimous: the dock would be dismantled, and Karen's position as president was immediately revoked. The sight of Karen, defeated and humiliated, watching her power unravel and her expensive gift sink, was the most satisfying moment. Her schemes had not only failed but had backfired spectacularly, costing her dearly in reputation, money, and power. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived at Crystal Lake. As the environmental agents continued their inspection and the neighbors began to disperse, a quiet calm settled over my cabin. My new, strong fence stood as a testament to my perseverance, a clear boundary that would prevent any future encroachments. The lake, now free from the shadows of an illegal dock, sparkled under the afternoon sun. I knew rebuilding the community would take time, but a new, positive spirit was already beginning to emerge, rooted in kindness and respect rather than arbitrary rules and control. And as for Karen? Her legacy at Crystal Lake would forever be marked by a sinking jet ski, a trapped fence, and a very wild ending indeed.